Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and we got some brand new class buffs on the horizon, making their way during the next week's reset. Tuesday for the region of NA, Wednesday for the region of EU. And this set of class tunings is actually going to be for PvE and PvP specifically, with a pretty big focus on trying to empower some of the class specs as well as playstyles that are not seeing nearly as much popularity or representation in the current meta, to give plenty more classes a lot more room in terms of which class specs and even hero towns they're looking to run going forward, while also trying to improve on some of the class specs that have absolutely fallen out of the meta completely, whether in raids or in dungeons. It's a pretty big list of changes which I kind of want to dive into as soon as possible, because there's just a lot for us to take a look at. I will leave chapter marks down below so you can skip over to the most relevant section, just so you can have the easiest time. Skip it to the most relevant section that you're interested in the most. Otherwise, if you guys want to see more regular updates for War Within, like patch changes and coverage and stuff like that in the future, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's just dive right in. So a lot of these changes are going to be coming out on a Tuesday/Wednesday reset, depending on your region. We got a mix of PvP changes as well as PvE changes, but I did kind of add them all up together, and I'm going to go over them class by class, spec by spec, starting with the class of Death Knight, who are mostly getting PvP specific adjustments. One, to help improve their survivability ever so slightly. Improved Death Strike talent should no longer be reduced by 50% in PvP, which increases the healing of your Death Strike by 60%. That's going to help a little bit. I don't think it will be enough to make Death Knights all of a sudden just Live Lord Mages or anything for the season, but it is at least going to help that Death Strike at least do something a little bit more meaningful than very little healing. But it's going to be just slightly more healing instead of negligent healing, if anything. For Frost Death Knight, we are seeing damage increases. Frost Strike is receiving a 12% damage buff, as well as Obliterate, so your sustained damage and burst damage are both going up by quite a decent bit with those changes. As for the spec of Unholy, the Mages of the Dead Shadowbolt ability is no longer going to be reduced by 50%. There's some value increases where the Shadowbolt can do a Shadowbolt volley, hitting multiple targets, so potentially for Unholy this could just be a little bit more overall damage through Mages. But also the ability of Festering Strike is going to be dealing 100% more damage within PvP content, so setting up those Festering ones and then popping them is going to add a little bit extra burst capability for Unholy overall. Next, we have the class of Druid, which is also getting primarily PvP changes, primarily targeting balance specifically. This is to, I think, try to improve Keeper of the Grove playstyle for Boomkin, sort of. So they're buffing the damage of your Wrath by 15% flatline. But they're nerfing the Keeper of the Grove's Blooming Effusion burst damage for your Wrath, nerfing it from 100% gain down to 25. So if you're trying to set up for like a really bursty Blooming Infusion big burst go as a balance, you're not going to be able to do so nearly as easily. I think this is mostly to discourage Boomkins trying to set up like a big burst one shot with Blooming Infusion by spamming regrowths, but mostly just to give them like a little bit of this, you gotta heal, deal damage to get better healing, just more of a promote this hybrid capability, but kind of reduce some of that burst capability and setup potential. Next, we got some changes for the class of Evoker, starting with Augmentation, and Aug's change is actually very weird. So for Augmentation, they're actually nerfing one of their tier sets, primarily the Neurobar Palace tier set. Specifically, I think it is the 2 set, where Upheaval does 30% increased damage, increases the damage of the next 2 eruptions cast by 30%. Apparently, some Evokers have been running that 2 set in order to set up some dastardly big combinations for burst, so they're nerfing that by a decent bit, slapping it hard, I think, to try to discourage the use of it, but also to encourage the use of their 4 set and the 2 set from the Liberation of Undermine. I always like when classes could do like a 2 and a 2 set. I think it's never optimal, but it's just kind of wild that the players would try to figure out some cheesy methods using that old tier set. Outside of that though, Preservation got some buffs, which is really cool to see. They're not super well represented, so any kind of buff is generally good, in my opinion. They buffed all of their healing by 4%, not impacting PvP. However, the next few heals do get impacted everywhere. Like your, not Chrono Flame, I guess it would be Living Flame, but it's getting replaced by Chrono Flame. The normal Living Flame healing, and I think affecting Chrono Flame as well, is buffed by 30%, which on its own isn't that great. But you can set up your big healing flames to be quite good. Like if you set up with Life Spark, that increases its overall healing and makes it instant cast. Then you have Leaping Flames or Fire Breath, depending on your empowerment charges, At max empowerment, it causes Living Flame to split to multiple targets, healing allies, damaging enemies. So that's actually kind of cool that you could do some real cool combinations with the Living Flame. Plus, you could also echo it to multiple targets. So there's some setup potential there, but also Chrono Warden further buffs it up by quite a decent bit. But they're also buffing the healing of Spirit Bloom, which is also really good. Big burst healing. Can also get very similar benefits to that of a Living Flame. But if you're playing Chrono Warden, there's like a healing over time effect for additional 30. So as this heals for more, you get a little bit more healing over time, reverberations as a Chrono Warden. So there's a possibility there in particular. Echo's base healing has also been buffed up by 100%. This means the actual heal from Echo is buffed. Not the healing duplication from Echo, that stays on its own, but the actual direct healing that you do from an Echo, that gets buffed up, which is a really weird change. Up next, we have the spec of Survival Hunter, which is getting a bit of buff up, what looks like for Mythic Plus content specifically. They're buffing the damage of your explosive shot by 15%, which means you're going to have a little bit better cleave damage and AoE damage, and maybe there'll be some builds that heavily will incentivize using explosive shot, like potentially deviling a little bit into self-aligned pockets or something like that for a little bit more overall output. They also buffing the damage of Fear of the Eagle, which also is a decent ability to use in AoE, buffing that one by 25%. So it looks like more of a Mythic Plus buff more than anything, and Survival Hunter representation on Plus is generally one of the lower out there right now, so I wonder if that'll potentially make a dent when it comes to their overall popularity. From there, we move on to the class of Mage, starting with the spec of Frost, and for PvE content, Frost Mages are receiving a 3% damage buff all across the board for all of their spells and abilities, minus Trinket, so it's not literally 3% buff, but it's pretty nice. This buff applies for PvE content like dungeons, raids, delves, and open world content, but it doesn't impact them in PvP. However, the rest of the changes we've seen for Mages are PvP exclusive. Like starting with Frost, when you play Frostfire, you get access to a blazing barrier, which means that you can actually get some extra value out of overpowered barriers, which increases the value of your shields by 100%, but only gives them a 4-second duration, but also gives them a bonus effect. Normally, Blazing Barrier component for Frost allows a portion of that shield's absorption to be reflected back at an enemy. They're reducing that absorption from 60% of the damage down to 40%, and they're hitting both Frost as well as Fire Mage on this set of changes. Speaking about Fire, the buff in the spec feels like all across the board, minus in the overpowered barrier. Yeah, that 60% spell reflection or damage reflection is going also down to 40 like it is for Frost. However, besides this, we're seeing a large variety of buffs. Pyroblast buffed up by 20%, Fire Blast buffed up by 15%, Fireball buffed up by 15%, kind of okay, Scourge buffed up by 15%, though they did nerf some of the interactions with Frostfire specifically, focusing primarily on the Isothermic Core talent, which causes Meteor to call down a Comet Storm now at 200% effectiveness instead of 250 in PvP. Where in PvE content is actually pretty high, for PvP that number is getting reduced down a little bit. However, as Frostfire, when you're playing the Frostfire Bolt ability, like they're buffing Fireball by 50%, they're also buffing Frostfire Bolt by 15% as well. So I guess you're gaining a little bit more sustained damage, but losing a little bit of this one-shotty burst potential. From there though, we got the class of Paladin, specifically the spec of Holy, and it looks like the Holy playstyle, specifically one of Lightsmith, has been falling behind by a decent bit, so they're trying to give it a little bit of a leg up. I've always liked Lightsmith because it does encourage a Paladin to be this melee battle healer Paladin with a Vengeful Crusader. I always thought that was really cool, but it doesn't really see a lot of play as of recently, so they're trying to make it a little bit better. First of all, talents such as Blessing of the Forge healing is now going to be increased by 15%. So while you're wielding a sacred weapon, that healing effect from Blessing of the Forge weapon is going to be a little bit more effective, which I think could make him just a little bit more bursty. Especially since you can synergize where whenever you pop Invented Wrath, and if you can get a very short cooldown, that can give you quite a lot of overall output. But also talents like Hammer and Anvil healing is also being increased by 20% as well. So there's even a little bit more of this synergy between Judgment and Wings, and potentially this burst healing that Lightsmith used to be really known for. From there, we can move on to the class of Priest, where Shadow Priest as well as Disc Priest are receiving a small number of changes. For Shadow, I feel like a lot of players are actually sleeping on this spec, but this set of changes could maybe make him a little bit more relevant. Shadow Priests are actually excellent when it comes to cleaving a handful of targets. Well, not amazing in M+, because it takes a while to set up all of your dots, Their damage is actually not that terrible, and they're actually buffing some of that healing, or damage rather, through Psychic Link. So, portion of your damage is usually redistributed and cleaved to every target with Vampiric Touch. Normally, 30% of single target damage can just get cleaved to every target around you. That has been buffed up to 35%, which is a slight gain, but a decent one nonetheless. They also buffed the damage of Halo, so this could actually be really good as a Void Weaver that just uses Halo for AoE, or possibly maybe make the Archon playstyle a little bit better, which is super heavy into Halo usage, which I think can be good in certain AoE situations. But to make sure the Void Weaver doesn't fall behind either, the actual damage of Entropic Rift has been further amplified by 12%. So it's going to be very interesting to see if we'll see an uptick of Shadow Priest, potentially more Mythic Plus dungeons. I think they really bring a very unique kit, which may not be the best for this season, but I always like the playstyle of Shadow Priest, so I wonder if we'll potentially be seeing a little bit more of them going forward. Besides Shadow, however, Disc Priest has also received a number of changes. First of all, the ability of Power Word Radiance healing is no longer reduced by 10% within PvP. This ability can be made into an instant cast ability, which further increases healing with Ultimate Radiance, which normally would kind of cancel out that reduction, but this healing is being amplified a little, so a little bit more burstiness for Disc Priest overall. Also, the big ability of Ultimate Penitence, damage and healing has been increased by 35% within PvP. So when using this big button, you're now going to have a little bit more damage output or better healing output as like a really big 4-minute cooldown, which is quite awkward in its cooldown. Like 4 minutes has always been weird within PvP content. It's like a little bit too long to be a 3-minute, not quite short enough to be a 2. It's just like super out of the way. But they're trying to make sure that this 4-minute cooldown always has the maximum amount of impact, it seems, for PvP content. From there on, we can move on to the class of Rogue, and it seems that Subtlety is getting a nice 5% buff all across the board. This isn't going to be enough to fix any issues with Subtlety. I think in certain encounters it doesn't do really well. It also is kind of limited on its talent options when it comes to raids or dungeons. It basically just has like one build that works for just about all content. But at least it's a buff nonetheless to bring up their damage, which has been falling behind quite a decent bit when it comes to the overall meta. From there we got the spec of Outlaw Rogue, which is actually getting a defensive buff for PvP content. Normally, the talent of Combat Stamina affects us a little differently for PvP, increasing our stamina by 12%, but with this recent buff, it's actually getting uptick to 18%. So slightly decent bit of gain to stamina, which means slightly better survivability, especially out of stealth. And I think overall it should improve some of the livability for Outlaw by a decent bit, because stamina, I mean, it just increases survivability, but also makes certain things like your Sippy Cup, for example, the Crimson Vial, just a little bit better because it has percentage-based healing. So that could be good in some situations. From there on, we'll move on to Restoration Shaman, and we're seeing actually a large amount of buffs for this spec specifically. Wait, has Drekthar always been in the Shaman Order Hall? I don't think I've ever noticed him here. Yeah, let me get a Drekthar's Blessing. I don't think I've ever actually seen this guy here before. I've been here forever and I've never noticed him. Huh. Anyway, so the Farseer has been, sorry about the tangent, has been buffed by quite a significant bit. Now, there's a bunch of different talents within the Farseer talent tree that's got buffed up in order to try to make it a little bit more appealing for general content. Talents like Elemental Reverb now increases the healing of Riptide by 20% instead of 10, though this change does not apply for PvP whatsoever. The talent of Maelstrom Supremacy now increases the healing of your Healing Wave, Healing Surge, Wellspring, Downpour, and Chain Heal by 25% instead of 15%. Also not applicable for PvP. The talent Offering from Beyond will now reduce the cooldown of Riptide by 3 seconds instead of 2, also not applicable for PvP whatsoever. The talent of Primordial Capacity also increases your maximum mana by 10% instead of 5, also, like before, not applicable for PvP. Finally, Hydro Bubble ability is now going to absorb increased, the absorb itself has been increased by 25%, also not applicable for PvP. However, the duration got increased by 15 seconds instead of 10. That one does apply for PvP, as it would seem. Although it doesn't stop there, as they are trying to buff up Restoration for PvP on top of it. Abilities like your Earth Shield, for instance, healing is being increased by 20%, and there's a number of talents that could potentially play around with the Earth Shield value, so that could be kind of nice in the process. The healing of your Earthling weapon buffed up by 20% to, I guess, enforce some of the totemic-based gameplay, because there's some synergies there as well, specifically. Healing Rain healing has been buffed up by 15%, which really buffs up the Surging Totem. And also Surging Totem healing buffed up by 15% as well, which is basically just a better version of a Healing Rain, but as a totem instead. And also the talent of Lively Totems from Totemic now causes free chain heals to be 150% effective instead of 100% effective for PvP. Specifically, I think just to give Shamans a bit more of a reason to potentially run into Totemic-based gameplay. Another hero spec that's also got buffed up by a decent bit is Destruction Diabolist Warlock. So a bunch of the different abilities for Diabolist has gotten amped up by a decent bit. Starting with Ruination, which is right here. So whenever you summon a Pit Lord, your next Chaos Bolt is transformed into Ruination. Kind of just like an Empowered Meteor that has the same value of Chaos Bolt when it comes to talents and such. So that damage is being buffed up by 35%, which makes it a lot stronger as an ability. Outside of this, the main abilities of all of your extra demonic summons have also been buffed up, like your Overlord that has this Cleave ability, Wicked Cleave damage buffed up by 15%. Chaos Salva from Mother of Chaos, that damage also got buffed up by 15%, and the Fell Seeker, which I'm pretty sure is the Pit Lord ability, also buffed up by 15%. So those are all specific abilities that every one of these extra summon demons uses. All of those got buffed up by a decent bit. Also for Deathstroke Gloom of Nathreza talent, enemies marked by Havoc will now take 7% instead of 5% increased damage from a single target spells to give you a little bit more of this cleave capability, and I think to help promote Diabolist a little bit further when it comes to endgame content. Outside of this, Warlocks did also get one more little buff for PvP, specifically. That is going to come from the talent of Demon Skin, and they're increasing the amount of armor it increases for you, normally increasing armor by 90% within PvE content. I'm not really sure what the value is for PvP. I wish they had a tooltip for it, to be honest here. But they're increasing the, in PvP, the armor increase is now being buffed by 30%. It's being made 30% more effective, so it's going to mean a little bit better physical survivability for Destruction Warlocks going forward. Or rather, not Destruction Warlocks, this is all Warlocks. This Demon Skin applies for all three specs, not only just Destruction. Lastly, we have the class of Warrior, where we're seeing a number of very specific changes, starting with the spec of Arms. Now, for Arms Warrior, they buffed up the damage of your Whirlwind by 100%. I think it's mostly if you're playing Slayer, for instance, and are playing around some Bladestone Whirlwind synergy, possibly. Though besides that little buff for Arms Warrior, Fury is also receiving some buffs, and it looks like they are trying to make your AoE a little bit better. First of all, the Whirlwind damage, if you're not playing Mountain Fate, buffed up by 120%. So Whirlwind is at least going to be a little bit more effective. It's like your only ability that you have, realistically, that isn't hard capped. It actually has a soft cap. It deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets. But yeah, I don't think that's going to help him that much in the Mythic Plus, but at least it's a leg up in one way or another. Thunderclap damage has also been buffed up by 25%. Mountain Thane Thunder Blast ability buffed up by 25% as well, so it should make it fairly strong overall. And they're both Odin's Fury, which sees some relatively little play depending on the content. They bought this one up by 30% as well, which was one of the few abilities that was nice in AoE, though after it got soft cap to 5 targets, it's not as good, but the cooldown is very nice at the very least. So it looks like they're trying to buff up Fury's AoE potential even by a little. So from there, we're back to Arms Warrior for PvP changes specifically. Now, one of the things they did is they actually reduced some of that execute value for Arms, reducing execute damage by 15%. They spent like a couple of weeks ago, multiple buffs back to back, trying to buff Arms Warriors execute quite a decent bit. But it looks like maybe they feel like they overbuffed them, so now they're going back and nerfing them. However, they are buffing the damage of your Rend by 15% within PvP content, which I guess is nice. I guess they're trying to have a trade of like sustained damage for execute damage, so maybe it'll be okay. And overall, it gives you less of this finisher pressure or finisher potential, but I guess it allows you to have just slightly more overall pressure outside of the execute windows. I don't really know. I'm not a big fan of it personally. I always like when Arms Warrior just felt satisfying with the executes, and I feel like they could easily make it like, I know we don't want executes to be overpowered or feel like you just get it absolutely gatted by every single one of them, but it feels super unsatisfying when they just hit like a wet noodle, so I'm hoping they don't quite reach into that category specifically. Then with that being said, as always, I don't want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very Very much appreciated. Join our Discord community to keep up to date with all the newest class changes and patch notes for the season. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.